Thank you so much, and thank you for the opportunity to spend 15 minutes with you. Gary reminded me yesterday that I ran into Gary and Unqork about 3.5 years ago. We did a demo for a prospective client, and the thing that Gary reminded me about was that the last half of that demo involved me taking off my business suit and doing the rest of the demo in a bicycle lycra outfit. I want to calm all of you down. That will not happen today. Gary made me sign a waiver. When I was preparing for this 15-minute slot, I thought about what I was going to spend 15 minutes on. First thought that popped into my head was, I can talk for 15 minutes. I can probably talk for 15 hours about all the wonderful things that EY does with Unqork. And I decided that that probably wasn't super helpful to any of you. My second thought included the bicycle outfit, but the waiver takes care of that. So what I decided to do instead was to try to distill the last 3.5 years of work with Unqork into something that you can hopefully, there's one slide, hopefully you can take something away, whether you are, whether you have, or whether you are thinking about doing Unqork implementations. First, I'd like to ground all of us, right, in why we're here. I gave up a safe, comfortable role leading EY's Guidewire practice when I ran into Gary. And I did that for one reason. I did it because I got excited about an opportunity to be able to use Unqork to very rapidly create applications that solve business problems. With quality, speed, and for most of you, speed means less cost. That excited me. I decided to take a little bit of a chance, started up a practice, and it's been a whirlwind for the last 3.5 years. I'm super excited about the new capabilities that Gary and Bassam talked about earlier. I think they'll make a big impact. These applications, they need to, of course, fulfill the business requirements. That's table stakes. But they also need to be secure. They need to be reliable. They need to be scalable. They need to be maintainable. And they need to be performant so that we can use them in production. I'll give you 3 themes that I think are worth thinking about as you prepare or as you go through an Unqork implementation. There's a lot of stuff with Unqork that is different. The speed aspect, the quality aspect, the way that we configure and develop applications is radically different. First topic is around the preparation. So before you get started, think about the impact of being able to take the development part of it and shrink that dramatically. Right? What we used to think of as coding or development and unit testing gets really compressed. Now, if you think about the surrounding people, processes, technology, and the impact of that, here are 3 examples. You should start with a larger backlog. Those of you who do agile development, you're used to some sort of backlog grooming in the beginning. Start with a larger backlog than what you're normally used to, because your configurators are going to come back to you sooner than you think and say, we're done, what's next? Think about the impact from a technology standpoint on the systems that we are integrating with, the APIs, the services. If you have a legacy organization that develops those, they haven't always, especially in the beginning when we did Unqork implementations, they weren't always, well, they weren't excited. They also weren't prepared for the speed at which the front-end part of the application was ready. So think about that and make sure that the entire ecosystem is marching to the same drum and on the same timeline. So you're not waiting for APIs and services. Now, that can be a very positive thing because it creates excitement and speeds up the entire process. And then finally, you're going to get to testing sooner than you're used to. So very early on, figure out what your test strategy is and your test execution plan so that you can benefit from a very condensed and compressed configuration development phase take advantage of that, and really drive the quality and the speed. The second topic is about the design. Now, my first point is that's not rocket science. You need to consider what I would refer to as the solution architecture, which basically just means what ecosystem is Unqork going to play in? The application we develop here is going to talk to something. And we need to make sure that we understand that and that we define and design what that ecosystem looks like. That's solution architecture. The second point that we've started doing about 1.5 years ago is looking at Unqork and looking at what I would refer to and what we now call the Unqork application architecture design. So it has nothing to do with the surrounding systems, but it is taking a look at Unqork, and it is honestly a page out of a playbook that I was used to when I coded custom development applications in the 90s. And the first thing we did always was we sat down and we figured out and we wrote a paper that basically showed us the design of the application. We're doing the same with Unqork now, where we are creating very rapidly an application architecture design. So it looks at Unqork and it says, we have a backlog of business requirements, but there are as many ways in Unqork to configure and to solve those business requirements as there are configurators. Each person will have a slightly different way of configuring it. And some of those configurations are better than others in terms of reliability, maintainability, reuse, and performance. So this point is really about spending not a whole lot of time, but a little time double-clicking and just thinking about how you are going to configure Unqork. And a couple of examples are, what components am I going to use? What is this page going to look like? How will I embed the different structures of that? How am I creating reusability? Am I defining components that I can use in another page or in another application? That's really what the application architecture design does. And that has driven a lot of benefits in the implementation. It makes the implementation go faster. Your brother talked earlier, Gary, about that telephone game of whispering in somebody's ear, and then 17 people later, you can't really understand what was being said originally. The application architecture design takes a little bit of that guesswork out of it because it provides a design and a framework for the configurators to look at that and say, this is what I'm doing. We very often have Unqork architects, Unqork solution architects look at that and verify that this is the optimal way of implementing it. So that is my plea to you, is to spend a little bit of time. It is so tempting with something like Unqork. It's so easy to learn, it's so fast to do, and it is so tempting to start configuring. The final point is around performance. This is something that I started about 1 year ago. I started waking up in the middle of the night thinking about performance. And I think it's because we began to use Unqork to create more complicated, more complex, larger applications. Some of these things we're doing in the marketplace now are very different. They're much bigger, and they are definitely much more complex than where we started 2, 3, 4 years ago. That drove us to have to consider performance. I spoke a little bit about it when I mentioned the Unqork application architecture design. Right? A part of that is the performance aspect. That design document outlines, I'm going to use a table here in this part of the UI, and it's going to ask questions around what's the potential of records that we can bring back into that table? Is it an agent search? Can we control exactly how many records we're bringing back? If the user goes in and says, I'd like to see all the agents, that could bring back 50,000 records. That's going to take a while. So the application architecture design then goes in and says, we're going to use pagination. Are we going to do it client-side or server-side? Those types of questions are answered in that. Performance is an aspect of that. Performance, in my head, has 3 different levels. And I think it's helpful to think about it when you implement in those 3 levels. The first one is the design aspect. When you sit and you create your backlog and you create your styling and your design and you look at the business requirements, you will, to a certain extent, to a large extent, influence what the performance of the application will be. So it's very, very important already at the design stage to understand the performance impact of it. Now, I would claim that I found that easier in the 90s, where I could look at the code and I could decipher it, I could run traces on it. With the speed that we're configuring Unqork and the removal of the code from the actual application, that becomes different. Not necessarily better or worse, but different. So the design aspect, understanding what some of those design decisions mean and how they impact performance, is important. Second point is, once we've then landed on a design and we start configuring, then we want to make sure that we really, as I said here, nail the Unqork configuration. As I said before, there are 100 different ways of meeting those business requirements. But based on the components you choose, based on how you configure the system, you can have a UI that renders in a split second or a UI that renders in 12 seconds. And it's much better to decide that up front and go after the split second than it is to find yourself in testing or in UAT with a 12-second rendering time and you have to redo some of the configuration. So think about it when you configure Unqork as well. And then the final level is Unqork, the base software. Now, what we're dealing with here in codeless architecture is that there's some sort of interpretation of the configuration into what actually happens in the application. So a very tight partnership with Gary and the rest of the Unqork team around constantly understanding what goes on behind the scenes and the decisions you make in design, in configuration, on your APIs, your services, etc., how that manifests itself into a user experience is the third component of it. That's to me, the black box that is Unqork, but the partnership with Gary and his team is super important. As we heard earlier today about the new capabilities, one of the first thoughts I always have when we get new functionality and new capabilities is, I'd like to understand that level of it so that I can guide and I can advise and I can make sure that my configurators and my designers understand what really goes on behind the scenes. So prepare well. Think about how that speed impacts the rest of the ecosystem. Make sure that you think about those 2 aspects of design, one more obvious than the other. And then make sure that you embed performance in almost everything you do, ranging all the way from your design decisions, through your configuration, and in your understanding of Unqork. And with that, I think if you do most of those things, I think you will be able to successfully and rapidly, with high quality, create applications that solve business problems. Thank you.